This is a crash course in counterpoint in under 17 minutes. If you could only study one thing in music, it should probably be counterpoint. Counterpoint helps you focus on the forward trajectory of music. It challenges both the logical and creative sides of your brain, and it will make your music richer and more sophisticated. Now, counterpoint is a subject that takes multiple semesters at the college level, so I'm not going to go crazy deep here, but you should get a good enough understanding of the basic principles. So when you do eventually take a course or read a 300-year-old textbook, you'll have a strong foundation and understanding of what's going on. Counterpoint is the art of writing multiple melodic lines that sound good when played together. The challenge is that you have to balance three things. The lines should sound good when played on their own. They should sound good when played together. They should maintain their independence and sound like separate lines. So let's get into those three things. Percy Gaussius, this guy Percy has a great book called Applied Counterpoint, and he outlines a few good rules of thumb for a good melodic line. Basically, the root, third, and fifth scale degrees will always sound stable. The second, fourth, and sixth scale degrees have a natural tendency to resolve down, and the seventh scale degree has a natural tendency to resolve up. Also, a leap wider than a third should turn and step in the opposite direction. There's a bit more to it, but basically, if you're mindful of the natural gravity of the major scale, you'll have a melody that feels natural and satisfying. Now, for getting two lines to sound good when played together. In counterpoint, there are three kinds of intervals. The perfect consonances, which are unisons, fifths, and octaves. The imperfect consonances, which are thirds and sixths. And dissonances, which include seconds, sevenths, and fourths. Now the fourths are a little confusing because we usually call those perfect fourths, but in counterpoint they require a little bit of special treatment, so for now we'll just put them in the dissonance category. In general, consonances sound good and dissonances don't. It doesn't mean that dissonances are bad, it just means you need to know how to resolve them properly so they sound like a nice harmonic rub and not like a mistake. The third thing to balance is how to keep the lines independent. So there are three different ways that the different lines can move. Again, notice that grouping of three. Parallel, meaning both lines move in the same direction. Oblique, which means one line moves while the other stays the same, and contrary, where one line goes up and the other goes down. Good counterpoint blends all three kinds of movement. If you only had parallel movement, the lines wouldn't sound independent, it would just feel like a thickened line. If you only had oblique motion, then one of the lines would be stuck and that wouldn't be a very interesting melody. And if you only used contrary motion, it would be hard to write a natural sounding melody because you'd be so restricted by the way you could move. So we want to write good melodies, we want them to sound good when played together, and we want them to still sound independent when played together. So how do we do it? For hundreds of years, the traditional method of teaching counterpoint is called species counterpoint. There are 5 species, which is really just kind of a weird way of saying 5 levels of difficulty. In first species, you write 1-to-1 counterpoint. For every note in your starting line, you write a note in the counterpoint in the exact same rhythm. By the way, that line you start with is called the cantus firmus, which is Latin for fixed song, and basically just means we already have this line, we're not going to touch it, we're only writing a counterpoint to go with it. So when you start writing a counterpoint, you need to start with some melody to write it to, and that's our cantus firmus. So we have the cantus firmus here in the bassoon. So before we get started, let's actually listen to that to know what we're working with. And now we're going to write a melody in the clarinet that sounds independent, but like a good line, and also works harmoniously with the bassoon. There are different opinions depending on the book you read or the teacher you work with about which note you're allowed to start and end on, but basically in counterpoint exercises, you want your first and last measure to be your one chord. So you're going to be looking to pick out the root, third, or fifth at the beginning and at the end. We're going to start with the one chord, so we have C in the bottom here because we're in C major. Our choices are the C, E, or G. For now, let's just keep it simple. Let's start on middle C right there. So we're going to start on this nice big octave. Obviously they work together. Now we have to decide what note to write next, but there aren't actually as many options as you might think. In first species, most methods recommend you avoid dissonances completely, so we really only have to choose between the perfect and imperfect consonances. The imperfect consonances, thirds and sixths, you're free to use whenever you want. They pretty much always sound good. But the octave and fifth have some restrictions, and maybe you've heard of this before. A fundamental rule of counterpoint is that your voices cannot move into a parallel interval in the same direction. The reason is that it destroys one of those fundamental aspects of balance, which is independence of voices. It's like all of a sudden for a moment you go from 2 lines to what sounds like 1. I like to think of it as if you're listening to a song in stereo and all of a sudden for like 1 beat it goes to mono. You might not even realize what happened or why it felt wrong, but for a moment moment something just seemed kind of off. So even though consecutive fifths might not jump out at you as wrong notes, you still will get this sense that the independence has been broken. Going from octave to octave is called parallel octaves. Going from a fifth to a fifth is called parallel fifths. And going from a different interval into an octave or a fifth is called direct octaves or direct fifths. If you're writing like a 4-part counterpoint and you have direct fifths in the middle voices, a lot of times people will let that slide because you can't really hear it. But when you're working in 2-part counterpoint or dealing with your soprano and bass, just avoid parallel octaves and fifths and avoid direct octaves and fifths. Just a good rule to follow. All right, back to our counterpoint. So we look at the G and we think about all of the notes that will work with it. We've already talked about how we're not using dissonances at all in first species counterpoint. So we're only going to work with the perfect and imperfect consonances. So that means above this G, we could have the unison. So we could go down to the G down here, which I don't think is going to be a very good sound because it's going to sound like the G disappears. That doesn't really work for me at all. Another option would be the third above, the B. We could also go to the D above the fifth. And the reason I won't do that is because that fifth, we're moving in the same direction in both voices. That would be a direct fifth. We don't want to do that. We could go to the sixth, the E, and that would probably sound pretty nice. We could go up to the G, that would be an octave. However, then we'd have direct octaves. I'm gonna restrict myself to either the E or the B. So let's listen to both of those. I like the B better. Neither one is wrong. Either one would work in some contexts, but in this case, I think the B has a nice sound to it, so I'm gonna go with the B. Now we go to the next measure and we go through the same thing. We say, okay, what are our choices? We could do the unison, which would be going all the way down to that E, which I don't think we wanna do, into the third, the fifth, the sixth, the octave, and then that compounds the third, the fifth, the sixth, the octave, all the way up. I don't wanna get crazy high, so I'm probably gonna rule out these guys here. I'm also worried about getting crazy low, so I'm gonna probably rule out these guys here. So these are some of my more reasonable choices. Any of these would probably work. Going the B here, we'd get a fifth in oblique motion, which is fine. Going here to the C, we'd have contrary motion into a sixth. Going here, leaping up into the E, we'd get contrary motion into that octave, and leaping up to the G into the sixth. So we're gonna hear, what are all those different things sound like? Let's go right from the beginning because it's not too far back. That sounds pretty nice to me. That works. There's also independence. And then just going back to the C. That's also pretty nice. And our last choice here was the B. I don't like that one. That's my least favorite. So for me, my favorite choices were probably either the C or up to the E. I'm going to go with the E because I'm looking ahead a little bit at what our choices are coming up. And I can see here that what would go well with the F, again, we're thinking of perfect consonances and imperfect consonances. So root, third, fifth, sixth are kind of our options, and octave. And I can see that the D would make a nice sixth here with that bassoon part. And I like the contrary motion we get where one is stepping down and one is stepping up. So here's what we've got so far. Now, I feel like we're just kind of hovering around the same space here, so I think to make this a kind of satisfying line, I'm already thinking, can I go up? Can I get somewhere a little more interesting? Where could I leap to? So what's going to work? What are some leaps that would work well with the A? Well, if I'm leaping up, I want to avoid fifths or octaves because I don't want direct fifths or direct octaves. So really, I'm kind of limited to a C or an F. So leaping up to the F would give us this kind of sound. Not as dramatic as I would like. What if we go all the way up to that C? I think that's going to work because I'm looking ahead. I'm already seeing what we could be doing for this conclusion here. This feels like harmonically, when you want to still think about your chord progressions, this feels like a 5-1 chord progression. So the third above the G is a B. We go from a third to a third in parallel motion. And then here we can resolve that B. We talked about how the seventh wants to resolve up into a C. Now I realize this is, like I said, this is a crash course. I'm moving a little quickly. It's just to give you the overall general idea. But let's hear this line. The only thing that's bothering me a little bit is I feel like this leap up a seventh is a little drastic. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this whole thing up an octave, and that is going to give us a little bit of a climax on the line here, but it's also it's smoothing over that D. That leap up a seventh was a little jarring just for the kind of pure old-fashioned context we had here. So I think that's going to be a little bit of a smoother line, which the top line is. That's a nice little tune. It's a little stepwise, but it's not horrendous. And then together they sound like this. Honestly, you need a lot of practice with this before you should move on, and ideally get a teacher to check your work. But because this is a crash course, we're going to move right into second species. In second species, or level 2, you write 2 notes in the counterpoint for every note in the cantus firmus. And this is where things start to sound a bit more like real music. We also get our first taste of dissonance, because not every note is going to be a chord tone. There are several categories of non-harmonic tones, including passing tones, neighbor tones, appoggiaturas, escape tones, suspensions, and anticipation. There are 2 ways to write second species counterpoint. You can start by writing a first species counterpoint and then adding those non-harmonic tones, or you can go straight into working with 2 beats against 1 and see where it leads you. I think for a beginner, starting with the first species and then adapting it is a bit easier, so I'd recommend you do that first. So how do we do it? Well, when you're starting out, I think it's really helpful to keep a list of your available options, those passing tones and neighbor tones and arpeggiation and all those things, and then actually mechanically check each one and hear how it sounds. Now that sounds like a lot of work, going 1 beat at a time, going through all your options, and at first it is, but with practice you get used to it and it becomes pretty quick. Eventually you won't really even be thinking about it. So here's an example of taking that first species counterpoint we did and changing it into second species. So we're looking for different kinds of passing tones, neighbor tones, and arpeggiation, and different things that can just add more movement to that top line. One thing that you could do that works nicely is start this on the second beat. And then what's really nice about that is then the entrance of the clarinet is going to be very clear, and it's going to really help with that independence of voices. So let's hear that right from the beginning. We get this real separation between the parts. It's very clear that these are different voices happening because they're happening at different times. So then the next thing to do is look at here. How can we bridge the gap from the B to the E? So we want to run through, like I mentioned, you want to kind of consider all your different choices and see which ones are going to work. Could we arpeggiate? We're kind of outlining a G major chord here with that G and B. So could we arpeggiate to the D? It feels pretty good to me, actually. Or could we do kind of a leap above and settle down into it? I kind of like that melodically. What I noticed, what I heard, is that we're moving into an octave here. And so even though our first species counterpoint, we were going in contrary motion to that octave, by introducing this second note, I've created parallel octaves. So I want to avoid doing that. So I think what we're going to do is go with the D, which was this sound, which should be nice. And then this is a 6, so we don't have to worry about parallel movement of any kind. So some different things we could do. We could anticipate the D. We could go neighbor tone, dip under the D. That's kind of nice. So coming from before. We could do an escape tone, so this E would go up to the F but then drop down. That's my favorite. Definitely my favorite. So let's go with that. So far this is what we have. That's a nice little line. Here is an opportunity. We could do an anticipation, which is where we play that next note before it happens. That works. And here we could do dipping under the A. What would that be like? That works. And this neighbor tone underneath. And then the other thing we have to do is just this last one. So we could mimic this where we step above. We'll do a neighbor above the C. That would sound like this. Now we get, if I do that, here I'll write that in. If I do that, then we get the fifth here going in downward motion into the octave, which again, we've talked about, you really don't want to do that throughout your line. However, for the cadence where everything is ending and we're coming to a conclusion, I don't think it's really a problem if we lose independence, because it's like, that's almost the point of this last note. Everybody's kind of joining forces like, okay, we can all be happy and harmonious together. So that might be okay, actually. We could also push this forward a little bit. By doing that, we would avoid that direct fall into the octave because we'd be going up into the third and then falling down. So that, again, that sounded like this. I think that works. I think that covers us. I think that kind of hides the underlying direct octave we have there. And again, I'm hiding it in a place where I don't really personally feel like you need to hide it that much anyway in a cadence. So playing this from the beginning, we took our first species counterpoint. Now we're adapting it to a second species counterpoint, which means we went from one note against one note to now two notes against one note. So first, let's listen to just that new melodic line all by itself. So something we've maintained, which I think is good, is we're still hitting a melodic high point and a climax here. So the melody still has a bit of an arc and a shape. It sounds a little bit more like real music in second species. So now let's hear them both against each other. And then the other thing you can do is you don't have to stick with half notes against whole notes. So you could start to think about a rhythm. So even there, even just every other bar, changing that to a dotted half to a quarter, start to make this sound even more like real music. In the spirit of a crash course, and to keep you from getting too far ahead of yourself before you've mastered the fundamentals, I'll just briefly go into what the other levels are like. In third species, we move from going to two notes against one to four notes against one. It's not really that much different from second species, and you can even start with a second species and adapt it to four against one. Fourth species focuses on suspension. So what do you do when one part ties into the next bar, but the change in the other line creates a dissonance? How do you resolve that and make it sound good? This is a really crucial step in that aspect of creating independence between the voices, because when one part ties over the bar, you get this rhythmic syncopation, and it really helps create separation between the different parts. So fourth species really deserves a lot more attention than at first it might seem. And finally, fifth species, or level 5, is called florid counterpoint. It basically means you take everything you've learned in the other 4 levels and use it freely, so you're just making music now. When you're ready to take learning counterpoint more seriously, there are a lot of good options out there. Score Club has a fantastic course called Practical Counterpoint. There's also plenty of textbooks in the public domain, so they're free, like that Percy Gershis one I mentioned earlier. I'll put a link to it in the description. For another approach to writing counterlines where you already have the chord progression worked out, watch this video here, where I write a counter melody to Zelda's Lullaby and then add a second counter melody on top of that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.